So good morning. We're joined today by Canada's Auditor General, Karen Hogan. We'll begin with an opening statement, then move to questions. Thank you.
It's quick, thank you. Good morning, and thank you for joining me. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. When I look at the 4 performance audit reports we've released today, I see a common thread where government organizations are often slow to effectively use the means at their disposal to provide the best possible outcomes for all people. As these audits show, outcomes are always far-reaching. Sometimes it's our most vulnerable populations who are disproportionately affected by the failure of government organizations to actively manage issues. Voyons d'abord notre rapport sur la gestion des situations.
Let's start with our report on emergency management in First Nations communities. We found that Indigenous Services Canada did not provide First Nations communities with the support needed to manage emergencies such as floods and wildfires, which are increasing in both frequency and intensity. Many First Nations communities are disproportionately affected by emergencies because of their remoteness or socioeconomic circumstances.
Over the last 4 fiscal years, Indigenous Services Canada has spent about $828 million on emergency management. The department's actions were consistently more reactive than proactive. It is spending 3.5 times more money on responding to and recovering from emergencies than on supporting communities to prevent and prepare for them. According to Public Safety Canada, for every $1 invested in preparedness and mitigation, $6 can be saved in emergency response and recovery costs. First Nations communities identified many infrastructure projects to mitigate the impacts of emergencies. Indigenous Services Canada has a backlog of 112 of these infrastructure projects that it has approved but not funded. Funding and building approved infrastructure projects such as culverts and dikes to prevent seasonal floods would help minimize the impact on people and the cost of responding to and recovering from emergencies.
Many of the issues we are raising today in this audit were findings in our 2013 audit of emergency management on reserves. I am frustrated that almost a decade later there has been little to no improvement. For example, Indigenous Services Canada still has not identified which First Nations communities most need support to manage emergencies. If the department identified these communities, it could target its investments accordingly. I am now going to turn to our audit of cybersecurity of personal information in the cloud. This audit looked at whether select federal organizations had the right controls in place to prevent, detect, and respond to security events that could compromise Canadians' personal information stored in the cloud.
When federal organizations decide to store Canadians' personal information in the cloud, they are responsible for securing and protecting that information. To do so, they are supposed to apply the baseline set of controls established by the Government of Canada. Our audit found that these controls were applied and monitored inconsistently across the organizations we audited. As cyber attacks everywhere are becoming more frequent and sophisticated, gaps in controls increase the risk of security breaches. We also found that although the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat first directed federal organizations to consider the use of cloud services 4 years ago, it still hadn't provided a long-term funding plan for cloud adoption. It also had not provided government organizations the tools needed to calculate the cost of moving to cloud applications and securing information stored there. These are necessary for federal organizations to plan and ensure that they will have the people, resources, and expertise needed to secure and protect information. Le gouvernement doit agir maintenant.
The government needs to act now, while departments are still in the early stages of transitioning to the cloud, to strengthen the use of controls to prevent, detect, and also to respond to cyber attacks. The adequacy of the tools and technologies was also a concern in our audit of maritime surveillance in Arctic waters. In this audit, we looked at whether federal organizations had the tools and maritime awareness which is needed to monitor traffic and also to respond to safety and security incidents in this region. The warming climate is increasing the accessibility of Canada's Arctic waters and generating new economic opportunities, for instance, in the mining, commercial fishing, and tourism industries. This increases foreign interest and competition in the region and also brings a higher likelihood of unauthorized access, safety incidents, illegal fishing, and marine pollution.
Gaps in the surveillance of Arctic waters and concerns about Canada's aging equipment have been known for many years. Our audit showed that these concerns persist. The renewal of vessels, aircrafts, satellites, and infrastructure needed to monitor maritime traffic and respond to safety and security incidents has been delayed to the point where some equipment will likely need to be retired before it can be replaced. Example includes Transport Canada's and the Canadian Coast Guard's aging icebreakers and patrol aircraft that are nearing the end of their service lives. Although plans to replace these are underway, there is no contingency plan if the delivery of replacement vessels is further delayed. This could undermine Canada's presence in Arctic waters. Le gouvernement doit s'attaquer sans tarder.
The government urgently needs to address the long-standing issues noted in our audit to put equipment renewal on a sustainable path and protect Canada's interests in the Arctic, including an improved capability to respond to threats and incidents. Let me now go to our last audit on the crucial issue of chronic homelessness. In this audit, we looked at whether Employment and Social Development Canada and Infrastructure Canada worked to prevent and reduce chronic homelessness. We also looked at whether the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation contributed to this objective by delivering federal housing programs and services that address the housing needs and improve housing outcomes for vulnerable Canadians, including those who are experiencing chronic homelessness.
Showed that although 5 years have gone by since the launch of the federal government's national housing strategy, there is still no organization in the federal government taking the lead on Canada's target to reduce chronic homelessness by 50% by 2028. In addition, the organizations did not know whether their efforts so far had improved housing outcomes for vulnerable Canadians. For example, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, as the lead for the National Housing Strategy, has spent about half of the roughly $9 billion it committed to the strategy, but it did not know whether those most in need benefited from these initiatives. This was because the corporation did not measure the changes in housing outcomes for priority vulnerable groups, including people experiencing homelessness. Nous avons aussi constaté que des logements locatifs.
We also found that some rental housing units created under the strategy that the corporation considered affordable were often unaffordable for low-income households and vulnerable groups. In addition, the corporation had not assessed whether those most in need were being housed. One of my biggest concerns is the lack of federal accountability for achieving Canada's target to reduce chronic homelessness by half by 2028. Infrastructure Canada and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation should be coordinating their efforts to deliver on the National Housing Strategy's objectives and get a roof over the heads of individuals and families. Thank you for your attention. I am now ready to answer your questions. Thank you.
Okay, we'll move to questions beginning in the room. If you're on Zoom and have a question, please raise your hand to be acknowledged. We'll start with Eric Sorensen, Global News.
Thank you very much. I want to ask you first about the emergency support for First Nations. You wrote and you've mentioned here this morning you found 112 eligible mitigation projects proposed that had gone unfunded. Government saying it can't fund them all. And your report found that Indigenous Services Canada is spending 3.5 times more on reacting to emergencies than it is on what it spends to prevent them. And you also spoke of your frustration. I'm wondering if there's both frustration, but any kind of explanation you have for why there's not enough money for the prevention side, but there seems to be ample money. I don't want to say ample, but there is much more money than on the response side afterwards.
Well, and that's where my frustration lies, in the fact that this is an issue that we identified back in 2013. In addition, Indigenous Services Canada had identified very similar problems in internal audits in 2013 and in 2017. And this lack of investment in preparedness is one we even saw at the beginning of the pandemic. And we don't recognize until it's too late as a government when it's time to invest. And what we found here was that 3.5 times more money is spent on responding and reacting. If you look at the statistics that Public Safety Canada has out there, for every $1 invested in preparing, you could potentially save up to $6 in responding. And so it really is a better way forward from a monetary standpoint, but also a better way forward for Indigenous communities and the people who are impacted by these emergencies.
Do you have any sense why it is that because it's not just in this regard, it seems to be that's often the case that the emergency gets the attention and the money flows because of the need, but that there doesn't seem to be that approach ahead of time to say, we'll save in the long run.
Well, we asked that question because this is a very similar finding about having unfunded infrastructure projects to mitigate the impacts of urgencies from our 2013 audit. At that time, and again during this audit, the department noted that they just didn't have sufficient funding to meet all of the needs. So Indigenous Services Canada gets a bucket of money for infrastructure projects. They are allocated over so many different areas, for example, safe drinking water, and then a portion, only 12 million to structural mitigation. And that's why there is a backlog of projects. We estimated that if that funding remains, it'll take almost 24 years to just address the projects that are sitting in the backlog.
Christian Noel, Radio Canada.
Bonjour.
Hello, Auditor General. When we talk about accessing to housing and chronic homelessness, what can you tell families who are on waiting lists, who see that the government isn't capable of offering them anything, or other people are getting access to housing but not them? What can you say to those families or to those individuals? What does this reflect in terms of how the government is managing the situation? What we observed is that the government lacks the information to be able to demonstrate if all of their activities increased or decreased homelessness, especially chronic homelessness. A solution to homelessness is one that should be based on data. And we also observed that there is a lack of coordination between Infrastructure Canada and the CMHC. When they're trying to work on the needs of someone who is experiencing homelessness, it's not just housing they need, but the additional support systems as well. And so these two agencies should work together better to improve the situation. So given this mismanagement of the government, what are you saying to the families on those waiting lists? There are supports that can be accessible to them. There are many groups or communities that receive federal funding, and it should start there. And these supports can help them out, and they can access subsidies. But it is up to the government to make sure that they are taking into account the objective of reducing chronic homelessness by 50% and to make sure that their projects are aligned with this objective. So it's really about time the situation was improved.
APTN, did you have a?
I do. So just to go back to emergency preparedness in First Nations communities. So in your finding, since you did the audit in 2013, has there been any progress on actual emergency preparedness, or has the money just continued to go to reaction to these natural disasters or emergencies as they occur?
So emergency preparedness has many aspects to it, and what we did look at was whether or not there was an improvement in emergency management plans, whether more First Nations communities had those, whether they had emergency management coordinators. And while there's been some progress, there is no understanding in Indigenous Services Canada whether more funding is needed for more emergency management coordinators. And so many of our findings are exactly the same, and the same that they had identified in the past. And it does seem that the focus is more on being reactive than being preventative. And it is a recommendation that we gave the government that it's time to see the value in investing in being better prepared and in supporting First Nations communities to develop the capacity they need to respond to some of these emergencies.
That's not just money, but obviously the government is spending a lot more money in reacting to after these emergencies happen than maybe putting in place some measures that would help the communities to be prepared. Do you think that perhaps there's a new, the government needs a new approach in how it approaches emergency preparedness, meaning maybe more devolution and transfer of money directly to the First Nations communities and let them sort of plan and prepare for these emergencies in the ways they know best in their communities?
I do think in the spirit of reconciliation that is one of the recommendations that we put forward is to do differently here. The approach to have multilateral agreements in place so that First Nations communities can access support in times of need is one of those approaches. But you need the First Nations communities and the provinces and the municipalities to all come to the table to do that. There's been time and money invested in trying to establish what comparable services might be, and so that roles and responsibilities are clear, but there's been no advancement in demonstrating that more multilateral agreements are out there, and that the communities know what to expect if they need to reach out for help in these times.
Valérie Gamache, Radio-Canada.
Hello. I would like your opinion on what's happening in the Arctic. In your report, you're mentioning that in 2011, the shortcomings were observed, but after 10 years, we're still saying we have until 2023 to come up with a strategy, and the strategy will be to adopt measures for the next 15 years. So when you look at this, I mean, do you have the impression that we are not prepared in the Arctic? We have a presence in the Arctic, and it started in 2011, as you mentioned. Federal entities that surveil the Arctic, they discovered the shortcomings and confirmed that these shortcomings are out there. And they started talking about ways of addressing these shortcomings, but little action has been taken. So at this point in time, there is need for immediate action to avoid very significant shortcomings in the upcoming decades. So delays in executing projects or initiatives, would it not explode the costs associated? Well, it's hard to say, but in general, of course, when a project is delayed or expanded, there are additional costs. In 2021, we had an audit on the national shipbuilding strategy. And during that audit, we realized that there was still some time to get back on track when it comes to replacing the vessels. But right now, what we're looking at is that in the Arctic waters, there have been additional delays, and there is almost no margin left right now. So it's really high time that something was done to address the shortcomings in the Arctic.
Couple of questions and then come back to the room. Raymond Filion, TVA.
Merci. Bonjour, Madame Hogan.
Thank you. Hello, Ms. Hogan. Just to follow up on this question on the Arctic, does Canada run the risk of not having a sufficient presence in the Arctic if this trend continues? It is one of our observations that if there isn't immediate action, that there will be very significant shortcomings in the surveillance and the capacity to respond to urgencies in the Arctic in the upcoming decades. That is why concrete steps must be taken, not just to analyze where there are shortcomings, but also to see what concrete actions can be taken to rectify these shortcomings. Thank you. On the cloud, utilization of cloud technologies, are Canadian intelligence agencies at risk? Well, our audit in terms of cybersecurity looked into whether the government had necessary controls in place to detect and prevent incidents of cyber attacks. What we observed is that, yes, there are controls, but it is the follow-up, the monitoring, which is not done in a consistent manner. There we are in the initial phases of transitioning to the cloud, but over the long term, there's a lack of monitoring just to see if these measures are effective. So the government has to tighten things up to make sure that the controls are there, not just momentarily, but over the long term.
Hi there. Yeah, I want to ask you about the homelessness report. If I have this right, essentially Infrastructure Canada and CMHC, they don't know if the billions of dollars in public money that they've spent, if it's been effective in actually reducing chronic homelessness. How do they justify that, blatant oversight? What's their excuse to you, and are you buying it?
So what we found is that Infrastructure Canada and Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation really have a big data gap. They aren't collecting the information to know if those most in need or those that were targeted by projects were actually being housed in certain affordable housing units. But they also weren't able to demonstrate that all of the activity was either increasing or decreasing homelessness. Some of it is a lack of information. In other instances, it's having information and not reacting or analyzing and doing something with that information. It's a very typical issue that we see on data management, but in the area of addressing homelessness, a data-driven strategy is a great solution. And they really do need to start coordinating their efforts to do that better.
And then on the CMHC program that supports affordable housing and rentals, I guess it's the National Housing Co-Investment Fund. So if I have it right, it is in 8 of the 13 provinces and territories, people are paying in excess of 30% of their before tax income on rent, which does not align with the national housing strategy. Is it your opinion then that this program is a bit of a failure if it's not actually hitting the target the government set for affordable housing?
So this program is at the beginning stages of it, and I do think that it's time that they could adjust the program to put it on a more viable path. We looked at 6 programs that Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation manages in this area, but the one about National Co-Investment Fund is the one that is supposed to develop affordable housing units. And as you mentioned, that would usually mean that it's about 30% of an individual's income that's devoted to rent. Under this fund, CMHC used a different measure of affordability, and they based it on 80% of market rent. So in an environment where rent is going up, that really results in units being very unaffordable for low-income families. That's why we recommended that a better coordination with Infrastructure Canada, but more importantly, someone being accountable for reducing that target of reducing or meeting that target of reducing chronic homelessness by 50% is really needed, because these projects can't run in silos. They really do have to complement and support each other, because we estimate it's unlikely that the government will meet its target if it continues down this path.
Moving back into the room, we'll go to Canadian Press. Nujud.
Hi there. So when it comes to the homelessness report, you say that this gap in data is common in government. I'm just wondering, is there a concern that across the government there's these ambitious targets and goals, but that there's actually no way of measuring if the government's achieving that? Are you concerned that this is not just about Infrastructure Canada or CMHC, that it's something to do with the way things are managed across the government?
We have this finding in many audits that we do. We had it recently in the Gender-Based Analysis Plus audit, where if you try to identify if certain populations are benefiting from programs, you actually need the data to know whether they are using those programs. And so that data gap is definitely one that my office has identified for a very long time. In this case, it was really, it is an ambitious target of reducing chronic homelessness by 50%, but you need the information to be able to measure where homelessness is when you start, and then whether or not you're actually making a difference. So for example, we saw that Infrastructure Canada had information about changes in usage of shelters, that more families were using shelters than individuals. So we didn't see them seeking to understand why that happened, but then taking the step needed to adjust their programs if necessary. Housing requirements for families are different than housing requirements for individuals.
And so when it comes to this data gap, I know that was one of the recommendations, was to start tracking and analyzing this data. And the federal government agreed, but I'm wondering, is there an opportunity to go backwards and assess what happened between 2019 and 2021? Or is this going to be a commitment that has to do with moving forward what they do?
Well, definitely, I hope that they'll do it moving forward. That would be our intention, to be able to see the progress that they're making. But there is information out there about shelter usage that could be gathered, and Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation could reach out to the organizations that are building the units to be able to let them know who's actually being housed in them. So there is an opportunity to go back and do that. I would like them to focus in on actually setting up the mechanisms to ensure they have that on a more regular basis going forward. But I think it's a great place to start, be able to measure whether you've actually had some progress in the first few years, to be able to adjust as needed.
Moving back to Zoom, we have Bob Weber.
Hi, I would like to return to the Arctic report. Forgive me if you've been asked this in French already, but a couple of questions. First, the report mentions threats such as illegal fishing and maritime pollution. I'd like to get a sense of what your assessment is of how urgent these threats are. I mean, people have been talking about these things for a decade now, and they have yet to materialize in any significant way. And how urgent are the threats that we need to address in the Arctic?
Well, with climate change, Arctic ice is melting, and it is definitely making the Arctic waters more navigable. We actually saw that traffic in the Arctic has tripled over the last 3 decades. That's a very sizable increase, and we only imagine that it will continue to go that way as it becomes more navigable. More traffic just means more possibilities and more risks for certain incidents, and also has a really large impact on the coastal Inuit communities that are there. The the ability to be able to surveil the Arctic and monitor what's happening requires tools, whether it be vessels or aircrafts or satellites or infrastructure. And all of those are aging. That is something that is very well known to the entities in the Arctic. And what we've looked at in this audit was the timing and expected timing of the useful lives of the current equipment and the replacements. And as those delays continue, there will, in the next decade, a gap will materialize. And that's why action is needed to make sure that those tools are there to help support surveillance and response in the Arctic.
Can you give us some sense of the way forward here? Now, do we need more things like ships and planes, or would it be enough to have more electronic surveillance, satellites, or some sort of surveillance system under the water?
I guess my answer to that would be a combination of all of them. It takes all kinds of approaches to surveil the Arctic. Not every ship needs to log its presence. Not every vessel has emitting technology. You need the support of the coastal communities. So the more layers of monitoring and defense that you have, the more secure that the Arctic can be. So it is a matter of investing, but also a matter of better coordination for all the parties that are involved in surveillance and responding to incidents in the Arctic.
I have no further questions on Zoom. Is there anyone in the room that would like to ask something else? Yeah, Eric.
Just one, looking at the report on chronic homelessness, and you identify, several groups, among them Indigenous people, and I'm looking also then at the First Nations report, the emergency support, and there are so many cases where they lose their homes and houses to fire, floods, mold, what have you. So there's a homelessness there. Do you draw any connection between sort of the loss of housing and the homelessness in particular for First Nations? I don't know whether, with respect to the homeless situation, whether First Nations occupy kind of a unique problem within Canada that is the same as so many of the other groups, but is also different.
Mm-hmm. So we didn't draw any links in those reports. They're very distinct reports, but you do raise a very important matter in that Indigenous communities and Indigenous people are often experiencing homelessness, are displaced more often by natural disasters. In fact, we actually put a case study in our audit report about doing differently, and that's something I think Indigenous Services Canada really does have to approach in collaboration with First Nations community. There was a community that decided instead of leaving during flooding, they requested funding to move to higher ground, their traditional hunting grounds, and were able to stay on their lands and were able to keep their culture alive instead of being displaced and moved to other communities. So it's solutions like that that are reached in collaboration with communities would help them in the emergency situation. When it comes to homelessness, honestly, I think it's just a much better coordination that needs to be had here. No matter what the vulnerable group is, they have different needs, but you need to know whether or not you're addressing their needs with your actions, and that's where the government was falling short.
Najud?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, as your role as the Auditor General, is this frustrating? Because, this report, at least for the homelessness report, you're supposed to look at whether the government's actually reducing homelessness, and you're not able to do that because the conclusion is that the government doesn't know. So, just in terms of you doing your job, is it frustrating that there's this trend, that there's no data?
I think the most frustrating element for me is that many of the issues we identify here, better support and prevention for Indigenous communities, gathering the information to demonstrate that you're getting value for money, are not new issues that we've raised. Dealing with the gaps and the aging of equipment for the Arctic is, again, not new. The fact that concrete action, there's very little concrete action, is possibly the most frustrating thing in that departments know. And so why aren't they taking the actions needed in order to make the lives of Canadians better? And I'll continue to do my job. News reporters, you should continue to do your job. Parliamentarians need to continue to do that. And collectively, hopefully, we will drive some change that will improve the lives of Canadians.
Christian?
Un peu dans la même veine que ma collègue.
In the same topic as mentioned by my colleague, when the Liberal government was elected, promised to have a government based on results. Now they don't have the data to show the results. So again, as the Auditor General, to what extent do you find this frustrating, and is this a failure of the government? It is frustrating because the program of having for people to have housing to reduce chronic homelessness, it is based on the data. So you need an approach based on the data, and it is very frustrating to not have this approach elsewhere. So in all the analysis I carry out as the Auditor General, if there's no analysis done, I try to do the analysis to provide the information to improve the management of data across the government. But this is, of course, something that needs to be fixed soon so that we are able to have the right programs and the right supports for Canadians.
Okay, thank you very much. That's all the questions we have. Thank you.
Thank you, merci.